Hello, everyone. My name is Ann Mason. I'm the Executive Director of the Plymouth Antiquarian Society. Thank you so much for joining us today for this first lunchtime conversation of 2029. 2021. I am really excited to be launching this new virtual program for all of you, and I hope that you are having a great day, having a great week. We are in the middle of the week at the middle of the day. So that's the idea behind these lunchtime conversations, just a chance for us to connect with you virtually and hopefully share a little bit about what's happening at the Antiquarian Society, some behind the scenes projects. And if you're on Zoom, I do hope that you will ask questions using the Q&A feature. And if you're also on Zoom, you can use the chat feature to say hello to everyone who's in attendance, to provide any comments or feedback. That's always, we always love to hear from you. And if you're watching the live stream on Facebook, you can also use the comments. Just add a comment on the Facebook video and I'll try to keep track of those as well if you have questions as we go. So we will certainly be talking together and then we'll also be responding to your questions. We do have some images to share. So at different points, we'll share our screen so that you can see some of the things that we'll be talking about, but we'll just get started. And I am really pleased to introduce our guest for today for this lunchtime conversation. This is, as you can see, I'm joined by Sofie Koonce, who is a lifelong resident of Plymouth. So she grew up here in Plymouth and graduated from Rising Tide Charter Public School and is now a junior at Smith College in Northampton, Massachusetts. And Sofie has been working with me as an intern at the Antiquarian Society since the beginning of January, and her internship is now coming to an end. And so she's going to share a little bit about what she's been doing and again, just going behind the scenes into the archives of the Antiquarian Society and learning a little bit in particular about women's history. So Sofie, let's start off by, if you could just give us a bit of background. What is your program of study at Smith and what interested you in interning with the Antiquarian Society? How did you get connected with us?
Yeah, so I am a classics major at Smith. I've been studying Latin since I was 12, so it's been a long time in the making. So I definitely have an interest in history. And I'm also a book studies concentrator as of this year. So Smith has concentrations which are a lot like minors, except that they have a practical experience component. So internships or jobs in the field are required to declare them. And the book studies program in particular is designed sort of for anyone who's interested in working with the printed or written word in really any capacity. It's a really broad program. I have a few friends who are doing things just across the board, but my interest has always been in history and in sort of historical documents. So I was really hoping to find an internship for my concentration that would let me work with manuscripts. So I was looking locally. And I've worked with like a couple historical societies. I worked with the Plymouth 400 and I did a program with the Antiquarian Society when I was 9, as we've talked about before. So I was really happy to come back. And I was particularly excited to be working with a group that does like recognize the importance of women's history so much. I mean, I'm a woman at a women's college, so there's definitely, that's an interest of mine. And it was cool to look at something a little bit more recent in history than where I usually am studying and a little bit closer to home. So I was really excited to get to look at local history in a way I don't usually.
Yeah. Well, and you did mention that you were a participant in one of our summer programs when you were 9. So that was such a great connection when you told me that. I was delighted that you wanted to come back to the Antiquarian Society and do a project with us. So I think you must have had a good experience in that summer program and doing some hands-on history. And as you said, that is exactly what the Antiquarian Society was really founded, as you know, founded in 1919 by a group of women who were interested in everyday life and in preserving some of that history that often is forgotten in terms of you know, what did people wear? What did they cook? How did they make their clothes? How did they make candles? You know, all those sorts of things, everyday life. And we have a lot of rich collections that speak to women's history. So I'm so glad that you reached out and offered your services for this internship period. It's been really wonderful to have you with us. And I guess I should say, when I say have you with us, I want to point out that this has been a remote internship. So Sofie and I have never actually worked in the same space together. She's been interacting with the archival collections digitally and virtually, and it's been a great opportunity. So in spite of that lack of physical proximity, we're still able to do this really exciting work. So thank you again for being willing to take it on. And yeah, talking about it, what is the work you've been doing? What have we been occupying your time with this winter?
Oh, there's been so many things. So one of the projects I was working on that I won't talk about for that long because I don't think people will find it as interesting is data entry. Taking, you know, the library collection and putting it into a database, which if I'm going to be working in libraries and archives in the future, which is currently the goal, is something that will be really important for me to know how to do. So that was valuable work, even if it's maybe not the most interesting to talk about. But I've also been working on a lot of transcription. So I started with a few letters, I think, and then moved into the Russell family journal. So that was a journal that was kept in 1962 to 1963, February to February, I think, for that full year, by the Russell family, which is one of the wealthy, like very, very social families of Plymouth. And it sort of documented their comings and goings and all of their social calls. It had references to the Civil War, which was really interesting to see. And it was just almost every day was a different entry. And so I went through and transcribed all of that and, you know, read through it. And that was a really cool project to work on. And then from there, I went into transcribing letters from the Spooner family, which is another Old Plymouth family. And those were, over the course of a long time, also 19th century for the most part, like sort of mid to late 19th century. And those were really, really interesting. That was sort of what led its way into the final project that I've been working on, which was selecting some of those, particularly the ones that centered around women and sort of the daily lives of women and their roles in their family, and turning those into an online exhibit that I've been working on, which has been a lot of fun, choosing those and annotating them and diving into the genealogy and the history and all of the connections to the other families. And it was, Anne and I definitely kept going on little tangents with it because there was just so much to explore there. So that's been a really cool project that I am still working on as of this morning, and we'll go back to working on after this. But that's sort of the culminating project of this, and that's been really cool.
Sofie, I just want to make a quick note, because when you mentioned the Russell Family Journal, I think you said 1962 to 1963.
Did I? 1862.
So I just want to make sure everyone's clear. We're talking about a 19th century family journal, which is in the Antiquarian Society collection. And one thing that I find, I just love that manuscript because it was kept by different members of the Russell family, so that you actually had to do a lot of forensic handwriting study there to figure out, well, which entry was written by which member of the family. Is it Catherine? Is it Anna? And so that was a challenging document to transcribe.
Yeah, it was really, really cool going through and figuring out from context clues and little handwriting things. But yes, it was definitely lots of squinting at my screen trying to figure out who wrote what part, but it was really, really fun.
Good. Well, see, I'm glad that you're still saying it was fun to do in spite of, even though you spent a lot of time in front of a screen for this internship. But tell us a little bit about the challenges of working or reading these historical documents. So first of all, the challenge is that it's remote. So everything that you're looking at I photographed or scanned for you, so you had it as a digital file, but you didn't actually get to see the originals, which is something we hope you can come back and visit them later on. But tell us about the challenges. What are some other challenges you faced?
Yeah, so particularly with letters, a little bit with the journal, but really with letters, they are not written for posterity at all. They are designed to be read by their recipient and no one else. So that makes things difficult in a couple ways. Handwriting, it's not designed to be really, really neat. In the same way that like even the journal at times was written more neatly because it was meant to be read by other people. The letters often were just kind of dashed out, and there would be references to things that the recipient would understand, so there's no need to explain. But as someone who does not know these people in the same way, there are names and things that are mentioned or alluded to that just completely escape me. I have no idea what they're in reference to. So there's a lot of sort of chasing things down that comes out of it. And just, handwriting in general, especially because the documents are so old, there's parts where it's kind of worn away or smudged, or, again, I'm working with the digital document, so there's times where it's hard to read things. There's the advantage of being able to increase contrast digitally, which is really nice. But yeah, letters aren't really written to be read by people 100 years later. Not quite 100, but a long time, or I guess more than 100. Can't do math, I think we've learned. But a long time later, almost 200 years later. And yeah, it's interesting trying to decipher things and figure out what they say when they were not written for me to read. And some things you can figure out from context, but names, proper nouns. There was one name in the Russell Family Journal that kept popping up that Anne and I both could not. It was about 4 letters long, and it came up so often you'd think we could not parse what it said. And there were no context clues because it's a proper noun. So we still don't know what that name is. So little things like that were challenging, but most of it I was able to get around.
Well, and even names that we could read, we sometimes had a hard time figuring out who they were referring to. So there are a lot of repeated names in the different families. And so we came across a lot of Mollys or Marys and Hannahs and Sarahs or Sallys. And so trying to figure out which Hannah, Molly, or Sally they're referring to became a challenge. And one of the other sort of difficulties in working with historic collections is that you often don't have, of course, the full correspondence. So like you were saying, usually you're dropped in the middle and you don't know what the person wrote, the day before. They reference a letter they received and you don't have that letter sometimes, often. And the same, you don't know what comes next. And so you're really dropped in the middle in this moment in time, and you're trying to figure out from other resources that we might have, from other documents, or just from local history knowledge, we're trying to figure out, well, what is the context for this letter? And that really has been a huge part of your internship. Is the transcription was almost the easiest part. And then the hard part was trying to actually understand and place these documents in their context. So it's been a dual process there.
Absolutely. Lots of researching genealogy and newspaper clippings and trying to connect the dots.
Right. Now, tell me, did you find anything surprising in the collections that you looked at? So obviously you've only seen a very small part of the Antiquarian collection. And I should note that a lot of what Sofie was reading and transcribing came from the families who lived in our historic houses. And so she's mentioned the Russells, and the Russells didn't live in the Hedge house, but Catherine Elliott Russell married William Hedge, who did live in the Hedge house. And then after their marriage, William and Catherine lived at 32 Court Street. So that's there's a very close connection there between the Russells and the Hedges. And so that's one reason why we have some of their family papers. And then of course the Spooners lived in 27 North Street, or some of them did, because we have Spooner family correspondence that goes beyond that one household. But that's a connection there in our collection to the houses that we maintain. But tell me, so what was surprising or exciting or anything unusual about the letters that you read?
Yeah, one of my favorite things that I thought was really exciting is that a lot of the letters really had a sense of humor in a way that really I enjoyed. I think one of my favorite things about studying history is just the way that people have always kind of been people and have, you know, acted in ways that we can recognize even if they lived a long time ago. So just seeing like siblings teasing each other or you know, children teasing their parents. There was one in particular I'll actually share my screen for. It's a letter from Esther to her brother James, and it's undated, so we're not sure exactly how old she was. We think she might have been in school at the time. I'd say she's probably a teenager at this point. Her brother James he was 4 years older than her, so they were relatively close in age. And she wrote this letter to him, and it was addressed like this. And his name is James Walter Spooner in Plymouth, Mass. And just the way that she went in and drew these little, they're like emojis, these little drawings instead of writing things out. The Walter Spooner, I think, is so funny. And this whole letter was kind of nonsensical. She spelled almost every word wrong and put on this sort of accent almost. It was this dialect. And the whole thing, it's this short letter, just kind of teasing her brother, just making fun of him a little bit, just messing with him. And I just thought that was so fun to read, and so nice to see that sense of humor. And there's a lot of times with teasing. There's a point where James is writing, or Frona, James's wife, is writing a letter to her parents-in-law, her father-in-law. And James adds a little note making fun of his family for not writing him. And he's saying, you know, did Plymouth sink? Have the rebels taken it? Why have I not heard from you in 4 weeks? Are you dead? And it's funny to see, especially because it's usually the parents chastising their children for not writing. So it's always fun to see that go the other way. But little things like that were really, really exciting for me. And also realizing that Esther had a really expensive private education was really cool. I mean, so a lot of the women that I was reading about were really well educated. Catherine Elliott Russell, too. I spent less time with her. Most of my time with her was with the Russell Family Journal. But just reading externally about her, she was incredible. She was an amazing woman. She was an antiquarian in her way. She really believed in preserving things for history, things that might be overlooked, lots of domestic items. She wrote a book about flowers, right? A book about botany, which was really cool. She was very into collecting recipes and local slang and just cataloging everything in a way that I really thought was cool. So just getting to see these like very bright, educated young women was really exciting, I think.
Right. And just to provide a little bit of genealogical background. So when you talked about Esther and James Spooner, so many of our listeners today may be familiar with the last Spooner who lived in the Spooner house, James Spooner, who died in 1954. And so Esther Spooner was his aunt. And so when was she born? 1830 something? I don't have the family in front of me. I know you do.
I don't either. I really should. I'll bring it up, but it was around then. Yeah.
I think it was maybe 1838 that she was born, somewhere around then. But so Esther, we're looking at her life. She's born in the 1830s, so she's a young woman in her 20s in the 1860s at the time of the Civil War, and we were able to track down her marriage in 1862, and then we also had some letters that she wrote after her marriage in the 1870s, and then unfortunately, you know, we don't have a photograph that we have identified as Esther. We have a lot of photographs in the Spooner, the collection, that could be Esther. They're the right age and the right period, but it's frustrating. So this is my reminder to everyone that if you have family photographs, make sure you go ahead and label them, which is always good. And that way your future generations will know who's in the photo. You may know now, but always remember that future generations may not have that knowledge. But we were able to sort of flesh out a little bit more about Esther's life. And we have these early mentions of James Spooner, who, again, we at the Antiquarian Society, he's the one who left the Spooner House to be a museum and left all of the family possessions to be part of this museum. So Jimmy has a very high place in the interpretation of the Spooner House Museum. And it's exciting to have these references from his aunt to him when he was just a little boy. And it sounds like he was a very rambunctious little boy. Because at one point she doesn't want to get worn out from a visit to her niece and nephews. So, but you're right. We were able to really highlight in our collection, we highlight some of the lives of these women, whether it's through their letters or through the recipes that they left, or through, as you mentioned, Catherine Elliott Russell Hedge left a large collection of sort of local stories, information, slang, even. She was just interested in sort of all sorts of aspects of life in Plymouth. And so some of her materials are now in the Antiquarian Society collection.
Yeah, and thank you to the people who pointed out it was 1835 that Esther was born.
Oh yes, 1835. I knew it was the 1830s. So there we go. We have that date.
I've typed it out so many times you'd think it would be burned into my brain by now, but 1835.
Right. Yep. Good. Okay, so if you could pick one manuscript, do you have a favorite? What would it be?
So
which isn't really a fair question because, we're not supposed to have favorites, but.
I have a few. The Russell Family Journal is a little bit of a cheat answer because it's so long, but I spent a lot of time with it. I think just transcribing alone was over 15 hours of working with it. So I've spent a lot of time with that one. So I'm definitely fond of it for that reason. And it was really cool to just get a glimpse at the comings and goings. And I'm always really interested in the daily life of things, like the daily life of historical people. So that was a really cool one. But I think I'm tied for favorite. I think there's two of the Spooner letters that were my favorites. One was that one that I was just talking about, that letter to James, that's just really like goofy, and just sort of a teenage girl teasing her older brother. I thought that was really cute. The other one was the letter that James wrote to his mother the day after his daughter was born. So his wife, Frona, was really ill during the pregnancy and birth, and after she was very sick, and the baby was also it was born with a cold, he was saying. So he's really, really nervous in this letter. He's saying he hasn't slept in days. He's really anxious about his wife's health, but he's also so excited about his baby. So it's almost frantic as he's going back and forth between panicking about his wife and just glowing about his new daughter and how she looks like his family and she looks like all of his loved ones, and he can't figure out who she looks like the most, and how she has this great temperament and she's so well behaved, and the way he just ricochets back and forth. It's really sweet. It almost made me cry reading it at one point. It's just adorable. And there was a letter right before that too, a very short one when Maud was born. And it's just fun to see, to see this letter, and he's, asking his mother for advice, and he's asking all of these questions, and so thankful for his wife's mother and sister who are there taking care of her. And he's saying, they are worth all the doctors in Boston. I'm so glad they're here. And he's like, I'm staying out of the way. I'm just doing what I can to help. It's just a really, really sweet letter, and it's very emotional in a lot of ways. So I'm partial to that one. I think that one's very sweet.
Yeah, no, it's an incredibly personal letter. And, obviously this is a young man who had a close relationship with his mother, because he's sharing all of these intimate details and his anxieties and his joy. And, it's not just, dear mother, our daughter Maud was born and, she is healthy. It's very much pouring out everything that's happening. And I think it is a little bit of a surprising letter to come across, because if we, we can feel a little bit distant sometimes from people in the past. And as you're saying, sometimes we forget that they were real people with, who had children and loved those children, and had experienced that excitement of being a new parent. And it's also a little surprising too, because you get this sense that James Walter was right there. He was, he was hearing the baby cry, and in another letter he talks about how he's changing the baby's diapers. He's a hands-on dad, and he had to be. And I think that's one thing that this project certainly helped me understand is, again, sometimes we think about the Spooner House, and some of our audience may not have visited the Spooner House, but it was actually an 18th century house that was expanded in the early 19th century by Ephraim Spooner, who was the first Spooner to live in the house, a very wealthy merchant, and a successful resident of Plymouth, a patriot at the time of the Revolutionary War, and he held town offices. So sometimes we talk a lot about Ephraim. We have 2 portraits of him that we can show visitors. But really, some of the later generations of his family, they were not as wealthy. So this particular generation, they were what we would consider middle class, and in some ways much more relatable, at least to me, than some of the earlier generations who may have had much more personal wealth. And so, we hear a lot in the letters, not only about these intimate details from Maud's birth in 1860, but also, details on Esther making huckleberry cakes for her father. And we learned from the 1860 census that she was actually identified as a seamstress. So she was, having to do some work at home in order to bring in a little bit of income. And so, she talks about ironing, and she talks about, again, growing peas and cooking peas for dinner. And it's a very different world than maybe we think sometimes. Again, especially with the historic houses that we have, sometimes we think about, the Hedge house is so grand, and the Hedges live such a grand life. And then being able to turn to these letters and really seeing the Spooners in particular, and living in much more reduced circumstances perhaps than we're aware. And I should note too that this particular generation of the Spooner family didn't live their lives in the Spooner house on North Street. So they were, sort of shifting between different properties, depending on Ephraim, the father's income and his economic position at different times. So they're very revealing, I think, and they help me, at least. I'll speak for me personally. They correct some of the misconceptions or stereotypes I might have about certain families in the past. So
yeah, I have one little excerpt from that letter that I want to read. Just this one sentence.
Yeah,
I catch on it so much because I think it's so sweet. James is describing Maud and talking about her and, what she looks like, and describing her. And he says, "I hope she will have her mother's good sense and kindness and judgment and prudence and symmetry of character and her father's taste." And I think that's so sweet.
That's great. That's a great.
I love that line. I think it's so cute. I just love how much he appreciates his wife and his daughter.
Yes. And it's one thing we can note is that James Walter Spooner and his wife Frona were actually in Concord, Massachusetts when Maud was born. And that was actually where Frona's sister and her husband had a farm, and they were living, seems like they were living with them at that time. And later they were able to come back to Plymouth, and they did live for a time at 27 North Street. But at that time, the house was sort of subdivided because there were the older relatives from the previous generation who were still living there as well. So it is interesting to sort of, again, get a glimpse of their life in one place at one particular moment in time. And I wonder if when James Walter talks about Maud inheriting his taste, if he's thinking about maybe his taste in sort of literature, and he in some ways was an aspiring writer, and He would go to Emerson's lectures, and he knew Henry David Thoreau. So there's connections certainly between the Spooners of Plymouth and the Transcendentalists of Concord, as there were connections between other Plymouth families as well, like the Watsons as well. So there's just so much we could talk about. all this web of 19th century Plymouth. So what else have you learned, just about local history, or about, 19th century Plymouth women that you have discovered?
I just saw the comment from Martha. I thought he was referring to his taste in a wife. That's also how I read that.
I love that. Yeah.
I read it as him saying, I want her to inherit all of these things from my wife, whom I love, and my taste, because I had
good taste in choosing a wife.
I think that's how I read it. And I think that's so sweet.
Good. That is, yeah.
Yeah. But to answer your question about history, it's so nice to have informal primary sources, because again, with classics, that's not something we get really ever, especially from women. I mean, anything that's survived has been rewritten and rewritten. So having things that are more informal is really, really cool. I think particularly it was just really interesting to see what women's sort of place in their family was and how valued they were. And just how much they were, loved and appreciated by their family members. I mean, we see that in the letter we were just talking about, with James fawning over his wife and daughter and his wife's family. Again, the line about saying her mother is worth all the doctors in Boston just made me so happy to read. It's just this appreciation for her and her care and her knowledge. And having these primary sources is really cool. Yeah, I don't know. It's hard to put into words, but it's been I feel like I'm getting more of a sense of what it's like to live at the time. And I think that's what primary sources can be really good for, just this idea of what a day in the life would have been like for a woman in the 19th century in Plymouth, which has been really cool to learn and to see.
Good. Right. I know it's hard, because we have to always, you have to do the extra work of placing these letters in their context, so that we don't sort of overly romanticize something that we read. And I know we talked about this, that we can't, we can't make assumptions about someone's life just from one letter. And so sometimes it feels like it would, we would love to say all sorts of things about these people, but we can't make those assumptions sometimes. So sometimes we have to rein ourselves in from that. But you're absolutely right. I mean, letters are bringing the everyday life to life for us as readers, and they do present some questions that we might not have thought of, and they sort of spur us to investigate the historical record in new ways, and to expand our understanding of local history, and of, in this case, 19th century history too. So are there any unanswered questions that you have that have just been burning in your brain? Oh no, if only I had an answer to this question. Or
there are so many. And the thing is, this isn't a question exactly, but I have never wished that I could talk to ghosts more than doing this project. I want to ask questions of these people. I mean, you were just saying we can't make assumptions about, their character, their behavior, or even really their relationships. From these letters, as much as we might want to, we really can't project too much. So the amount that I want to meet them and ask them everything, and really get an idea for how they are and who they are as people, because I'm getting, ideas from these letters, and I'm feeling like I'm starting to get to know them, but I would love to be able to talk to them and ask them about things. And there's some stories that we found that I think are so interesting, and I'd love to know more about. There's the double wedding in Sharon, which was Esther and her cousin, both married men that were going off to war like the next week. And there was another wedding in Plymouth a few days later to a third man that was friends with the other two. And I want to know how that whole situation played out. I want to know if they had been kind of courting before, or if this was a spur of the moment choice. I mean, these three close male friends married these three female cousins and then all went off to the 13th Regiment together. And I want to know that whole story. And that's something that we can piece together a little bit. We know it happened, but I want to know, you know, the gossip about it. I really want to know from them. I want to hear that story. And that's just something I don't think we can answer, but it's a question that I wish we could, because I think that's so interesting as a story.
Right. Well, and Sofie, you should take some credit, because one of the questions that we had while you were transcribing the, you know, some of these documents is that Esther Spooner starts referring to a gentleman named George. And from the letter you're reading, it seems like she must be married to him, because they're, you know, they're living together, and she's applying some kind of iodine, is that right? To like a sore shoulder he has or something. So clearly this is a close relationship. But the genealogy that we had for the Spooner family did not say that Esther's husband's name was George. It actually said his name was Horace Shepherd. And so that sent you on a research project to figure out, well, who on earth is this George? Did she marry Horace first and then he died and she married George, or what's going on here? And so we were able to actually remove Horace from the family tree, or at least that part of the family tree, because Esther did not marry him. He married her cousin, as you noted, in that double wedding in 1862. So it makes sense that someone would have confused the two grooms, perhaps. But we were able to actually put Esther's real husband, George Sawyer, on the family tree, and to uncover that story of that double wedding on the eve of their going off to the Civil War. And Sofie, I think it's so interesting, because in the letter, it's like we only have like 2 letters that Esther wrote in 1862, and in one of them it's before she's married, and she's talking about how all unmarried unmarried young men should be going off and joining to fight for the Union. And then like the next week is when she gets married, and she ends up sending her young husband, who of course is married at that point, off to the war. So it's interesting to think about how these local, just the local experience of the Civil War. And you can read in a newspaper from 1862 about, the recruitment of soldiers for the Union, and there's lists of the men from Plymouth who are volunteering, but to have this personal family experience of, a young couple who decides to get married right before they go off to war it's just very, very fascinating.
It is. I'm looking for those newspaper articles you found about it, because there's a few questions in the Q&A about if they all survived, and they all did. But they all did get injured, I think, on the same day.
Right, right.
They all got wounded together. One of them was, I have the article open. A singular coincidence of accidents happened to Misters Thurber, Sawyer, and Shepherd, who it will be remembered left us but a little while ago to join the 13th Regiment. So one of them was struck by a ball that went through him and then into James Thurber's leg. So injured by the same piece of shrapnel, and then the other was shot, but they did all survive. But they all were injured. They all got married together, went off to war together, and were injured together. It's just such an interesting story. It feels like something out of a period drama, but it really did happen. And I'd love to, I want to know more about it.
Right. Right. Yeah. Especially in terms of, and again, it's from the letters, we do, we've sort of made guesses about some of the first nicknames. Like, so there's a Molly who's mentioned around that time by Esther. And so, I think, well, maybe this is Mary Bartlett, who is Esther's cousin, who marries James Thurber. And it makes sense because it seems like Molly and Esther are spending time together and getting their husbands ready for war together. So it's just but we don't know for sure. It could have been another Molly. And yes, it is interesting about that. So I don't know if you see the other questions up. So we have a question about references to African Americans living in Plymouth and interacting with the Russell or Spooner families in the 19th century.
There's one in one of the Spooner letters. There's an unnamed person who's mentioned very briefly, but other than that, if there are people of color mentioned, that it's not specified. There's not really any references that I know of. No, there was one Esther uses a French phrase and tells her mother that she'll have to ask someone what it means. But it's the only mention that comes to mind.
Okay. Right. And so it could just be that we're not as familiar with the names of some of the African Americans that, you know, and one thing that's important to note is that, of course, the Spooner family in particular, you know, where they were abolitionists. So I think probably the most noted abolitionist in the Spooner family was Born Spooner, who was the brother of Esther Spooner's mother. So Born Spooner was Esther's uncle. And certainly, you know, we know he was a leading abolitionist in Massachusetts, as were his son, Nathaniel Born Spooner, and his wife, Zilpha Harlow Spooner. So we have a lot of abolitionists in the broader Spooner family, but we're not really getting necessarily a lot of mentions of, you know, well, not a lot of conversation about that. I think the only thing I can think of is in one of Esther's, in the letter where she talks about young men going to war, one of the reasons for going to war is to free the slaves. So that's the only time I think slavery is mentioned in these letters. But again, we only have a very small number of letters. Oh, and actually Mary Spooner, who's Born's sister, when she's on a trip to New York, she mentions the attack on Charles Sumner in the 1850s, which happened on in the floor of Congress. And so that was, you know, her reference to the, you know, sort of the antebellum conflict happening between the northern politicians and southern politicians, and northern states, southern states, you know. So we do have glimpses of that. But again, this is not a full collection of letters. So if we had a full collection, you know, we might have letters from, you know, Mary to her brother Born more about abolition, or, you know, it's almost, that's the thing that can be very frustrating, is when you just say, oh, I wish they had saved just a little bit more, because they saved a lot, but what about the rest of the story?
Yeah, and a lot of the letters we've been talking about are the ones that have a lot of substance. I mean, some of the ones are really just the weather and, you know, whatever friends they saw in the last week. A lot of these letters there's just not a lot in them. It's largely, you know, pleasantries and things like that. So I definitely wish we had more material, but isn't that always the case?
Yeah, right. Now, another question that came in is, can you say more about a day in the life of a 19th century woman? So things like, when did they get up? Did they have specific tasks on specific days? When were meal times? So were details like that in those letters?
Yeah, things like that are sometimes mentioned. Often in the case of when they're signing off a letter, it'll be, well, I got up early this morning and I want to get an early night. I have plans tomorrow, so I'm going to sign off now. It's 9 o'clock. Things like that. The journal was good for things like that. Not specific times, but for tasks that were done in a day. The Russell families, the women of the Russell family spent a lot of time at the sanitary building, making like bedding and things to send to soldiers. So a lot of time for those women was spent on charity work and things like that. A lot of time for Esther would be spent on work or seeing family. So a lot of time was spent on sort of domestic tasks. It's hard to get exact times and things like that, but domestic work and cooking and socializing seem to be the tasks that took up the majority of an average day in the life of one of these women, who of course were upper and middle class. So that would have been different for working class women, I'm sure. But for the upper class white women whose letters we're reading, that was kind of how their days tended to be broken up.
Okay, well, I was just checking on the Facebook stream to see if we had any questions, and I wasn't seeing any. I might have missed them. I I think one question that we sort of wanted to finish with, Sofie, was the question about why you think this work is important, or why it was worth your spending your winter term to do this work in our collection.
Yeah, so I think studying history is important. I obviously think that's the case, but I think when it comes to trying to understand the past, making sure that you're being careful to understand it as it was, and not just as it is like it's generally represented or presented, because I think misconceptions are really easy to come across and they happen sort of naturally. So really returning to primary sources whenever that's possible, and learning even just the minutia of daily life, I think is really, really important in having a full three-dimensional understanding of what the past was like. I think it's really easy to fall into stereotypes, and I think working to realize that that might not be true, and the way that we picture the past might be colored by any number of things, I think is really important. And particularly with this internship, it was really, really rewarding to look at local history. I mean, I grew up in Plymouth. I've lived there pretty much my entire life. And learning more about the history of the town was really, really interesting, and a way to sort of place myself into a broader historical context, and looking at the women who lived in my hometown 200 years ago and what we have in common and what we don't. And seeing things like that, I think, is a really good way to understand kind of how you exist in the broader history of where you're from. So I think it was really rewarding that way.
Yeah, good. Now, why don't we, Sofie, why don't you share your screen and sort of walk the viewers through the website, so you can, which is not live yet. I should say we're not quite ready to publicize it and have everyone read the letters, but Sofie has, as she mentioned, been creating this website, which will include all of her transcriptions as well as annotations. So as much as we can, we've tried to identify the people mentioned in the letters, provide some background on them, identify places, identify, you know, obscure references to something that if we were able to figure it out, we've tried to give that information to you. So go ahead, Sofie.
Great. Yeah. Let's bring that up. So I'll show a couple pages. This is just sort of the home of this, and we'll have a menu eventually, but WordPress can be challenging. So this is sort of an explanation of the project and the collection, just an introduction to everything we've been working on. And, you know, we've covered a lot of it during this conversation, but just the idea of looking at letters as a way to bring history to life, and as a primary source to provide some insight into daily life. And then here is one of the letters. So you can see all of these bolded things are things that we felt needed notes for context. So they all have these little pop-ups on them. Some of them also include links and things like that. There's lots of mentions to flowers and other things that we wanted visuals for. So we've been working a lot on, this is a pretty big note because there was a lot to say about this. So we've been going through and adding these annotations to provide context to read these, because I've spent a lot of times with these letters in a way that most people have not. So really going in and making sure they're accessible. I think, you know, accessibility is really important when it comes to history and learning history. So it was something I was really, really happy to work on. So this is one of the 10 letters. There's the file at the bottom too, with the original manuscript PDF, if that's something anyone's interested in seeing. Yeah, so this has been sort of the crux of this project, which is really, really cool to see it coming together. I'm very excited for it to be live and ready to be seen. And you'll send that link out, I'm sure.
Yes, I will send you know, an announcement with the link for the portal into these letters. And again, we're sort of viewing it as a little bit of an online exhibit, so that, you know, we've provided, again, a context at the beginning of each letter, and we do have some bios on the letter writers and the timeline. And, you know, we do, as much as we could, we've tried to provide images of some of the people that are mentioned. And again, we're at the mercy of our collection and the limits of our collection. So it's always interesting to see that we have, you know, there are some people that we have 100 photographs of, and then there are some people that we have no photographs of. So Born Spooner, who we mentioned as, you know, a prominent abolitionist, he was the founder of the Plymouth Cordage Company. And we have a lot of photographs of him. We have a portrait of him, but we don't have as many. Well, actually, I can't find any photographs of his sister, Mary, who was Esther's mother. And so it's one of those mysteries. They might be in another local collection. They might be in our collection, but unidentified. So, you know, it's just something that we can add as we go if we find anything that we think will help sort of, again, bring these people to life and sort of round out the letters a little bit more. We can certainly add to this online collection as we go. So, and my goal sometime would be to actually present a similar collection for some of our other you know, archival collections. So this is sort of a representative of the Spooner family papers that we have, but we have, as Sofie has mentioned, Hedge family papers that she has actually already transcribed. So she's already done that work. And so maybe we'll be able to share those as well. But we know that, especially in this time of, you know, restricted access, restrictions on in-person gatherings and events, we wanted to be able to share something that you could just dive right into from home, and for free, of course. This is our mission, to preserve and share local history. So we're really excited that Sofie could partner with us in doing that. So we have a couple of questions. So yes, in answer to the question, will the original letters be viewed? So on the online exhibit, as Sofie pointed out, the primary, what you'll primarily see is the transcription, because that's where we could put all the annotations, but the actual PDFs of the original documents will be viewable. You can just click and download and see those as you go. And
yeah, this is one of them. This is of the letter that I brought up. So they've all been converted into PDFs. They can be viewed on the website or downloaded. We wanted to make sure those were accessible, especially because there were a few words that we couldn't read. And if you would like to take a crack at them.
Yes.
But yeah, that we wanted to make sure those were accessible. I think that it's really cool to be able to see them. The manuscripts are just a lot more, or the transcriptions are a lot more accessible than the original manuscripts, but they're available to view and download.
Right. Yeah. Yep. And I mean, if you want, you can have them open on 2 tabs. So you can actually read the transcription and have the document open so you can look at them together. And as Sofie said, there may be words that we couldn't make out, but that you'll be able to decipher for us. And so if anyone has any suggestions about that, we have shared the project with our collections committee and with some local experts, so that they've been able to give us great feedback. And but we're always open to more feedback. So I'm sure there's people out there who know more than I do about the Spooners. So feel free to provide any feedback once the site is live and you can see it. We did have a question about the Plymouth Center for the Arts, so which is on North Street, and you're absolutely right. So the Russell Building, which was the old library building on North Street, is right next to the Spooner House Museum at 27 North Street. And so the question is, was there any mention of the building that was the library? And I don't think there was any mention. Well, actually, there couldn't have been, because the library was not built. We didn't actually get to to any letters that would have been written after the library was built, because that wasn't built until the early 20th century, I believe. And so all of these were mid to later 19th century letters. But the Russell family is, you know, the same Russell family. I mentioned that they lived at 32 Court Street, which is that beautiful beautiful house, federal mansion on the corner of North Russell Street, again named after the Russell family, and Court Street. And it was Nathaniel, the first Nathaniel Russell, who was one of Plymouth's earliest and most successful industrialists. So that was where the family wealth came from, was from the family factories and other industrial endeavors. And so they were able to own, they owned quite a bit of land right there at that corner. And then they built, well, they didn't build the grand house, but they occupied that beautiful house. So they, they were a prominent family in Plymouth for many years. Okay, so I'm seeing, let's see, we have some chats coming in. Looks like everyone is so excited, Sofie, to see the finished product. So this is really, really wonderful. We would love to, we can't wait to share it with you. So I'm just checking to see if there are any other questions that are coming in, and I'm not seeing any. So what I'm actually going to do now is present a special bonus for those of you who are on Zoom. You will receive this bonus in your inboxes because I have your email addresses. If you're watching this through Facebook, if you're watching the recording, you're going to actually have to wait until the exhibit goes live, the Spooner family exhibit goes live, because we have, and I'm just going to share my screen here so you can see it. All right, we've mentioned that one of the really exciting, rich parts of our collection are the historic recipes. And so at the Spooner House, we have a large collection of Spooner family related recipes. We have other recipes in the rest of our archives related to other families. But this is a recipe from a notebook that was owned by Frona Spooner. And you can see the title of the recipe is Cake from Esther. And Esther, I should say, was one of the nicknames for Esther Spooner. So Frona was Esther's sister-in-law. And Frona was actually the mother of Jimmy Spooner, the last Spooner to live in the Spooner house. So I don't know if that clarified who I'm talking about for you. There will be a family tree on the online exhibit page, so you'll be able to study it and disentangle all these people from each other. But in any case, what we have here is a very simple recipe from Frona. I love it because, as you'll see in the exhibit, we have letters from Esther. She's one of our primary letter writers. And, in the letters, we do get a sense that Esther will send things to her sister-in-law Frona, and her sister-in-law Frona will ask for certain, they clearly have a relationship where they're writing letters back and forth to each other while Esther's in Plymouth and Frona is in Concord. And so here's a recipe for a cake that Frona received from Esther. And the reason I'm showing this to you is because a local food historian, Paula Marcoux, who is actually on our presentation today. She's joining us through Zoom. So hi, Paula. Paula, when she found out about Sofie's project, said, well, I would love to share a recipe that's connected to this collection. And so this is the recipe that we chose. Paula thinks it's probably from sort of sometime in the early 1860s, I think. So that, again, is the time when Esther is living in Plymouth right before she gets married in 1862. Frona's living in Concord and then comes back to Plymouth later. But this is a very simple, pretty plain cake. So it's not flavored with vanilla, which we might expect today. It's actually flavored with ginger, and Paula has worked the recipe so that it will actually work for a modern baker. And she has given us permission to share her recipe so that you can all make this cake at home if you want to. And she adds some notes in there about if you want a more flavorful cake, you can double the amount of ginger that she suggests, or you can serve it. It would be perfect served with some berries and cream or ice cream. And I love this recipe, again, just because it shows that link between the two sisters-in-law. And I think, we think about all the many different ways that we're connected to family members. And one way, at least in my family, is through food. Food is important to us in terms of family gatherings. And I often share recipes with friends. So it's sort of that nice connection between two individuals and two families. So just to get you excited for this recipe, here it is. These are Paula's photographs of the cake, Esther's cake, after she baked it. So again, if you registered for the Zoom meeting, I have your email address. I will email the recipe to you today so that you can bake it. Or if you're not connected to us via email, then Sofie's going to include it in the online website. And again, I think I mentioned that there are references in Esther's letters to things that she's baking. So she talks about huckleberry cake. And certainly this is a cake that doesn't have berries in it, but you could serve berries on it. So you could get a taste of the past in that way. And I want to finally, before we close, just let you know that we will be having another lunchtime conversation next month. So a month from today, Wednesday, March 10th at 12:30, we are actually going to be able to talk with Paula Marcoux about local food history. And Paula wanted me to let you all know that she has been doing more recently some research on George Gray. And so she is trying to learn about mid-19th century Black Plymouthians, especially those coming from the South. So I think we had that question earlier about, do the Spooner letters reveal anything about African Americans? And Paula is the one who has really been trying to, focus on that question of mid-19th century African Americans in Plymouth. And so at the next lunchtime conversation, you may hear about those histories, and it's I'm very much looking forward to it. And so you can actually register for that lunchtime conversation via Zoom on our website. That link is up, and I think actually when you end the Zoom, the link will automatically pop up on your browser so that you can register for it right away, and you won't forget. But I think, do we have any other final questions? I think we've covered it. Sofie, anything you wanted to add?
No, I'm very excited for this website to go live. I'm really excited for it all to be accessible for everyone to see.
Yes. Yeah, I am too. And thank you, Sofie, again for dedicating your winter in order to work on these letters and all the other things that you've been doing to help with our archival collection and our library collection. And we are very excited for all of you to see the exhibit, to read the letters on your own, and hopefully learn more about Plymouth history and the mid-19th century. And then again, finally, I will plug again, please do join us next month for our conversation with Paula. All right, everyone, I'm going to end the meeting now, and thanks so much. Have a wonderful rest of the day, and thank you, Sofie. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.